The tower rose high above the forest like a scar against the sky, its stones weathered by centuries of wind and rain, its windows narrow slits that let in only fragments of light. The villagers called it the Tower of Silence, though the silence inside was never complete. The girl who lived there, imprisoned against her will, could hear the groaning of the old stones at night, the restless scratching of branches when storms gathered, and the whispers of her own thoughts echoing endlessly. She had been taken there not because she was guilty of any crime, but because she was different. Since childhood, strange things followed her. When she spoke too softly, the air carried her words farther than they should. When she closed her eyes in sorrow, candles flickered without breath. When she dreamed, people in the village claimed they saw shadows moving in their homes. Fear grew like a weed, and when fear takes root, it does not ask questions. The elders decreed she was dangerous, a spirit child, a vessel of unrest, and so she was locked away. The tower itself was ancient, built in a time when clans fought against shadows and sky. No one knew who had raised it, but everyone agreed it was cursed. It stood on a hill where the earth refused to grow crops, surrounded by a forest that never seemed to end. Trees bent toward it, branches scratching the walls as though trying to reach the girl within. When storms came, the clouds curled thick and heavy around the tower as if drawn to it. Lightning struck close but never upon it, and the sound of thunder echoed like drums of war. From her tiny window, she could see only the tops of the trees swaying violently, their leaves shimmering like restless spirits. Inside, the tower was a prison disguised as a monument. The stones were cold, damp with years of rainwater leaking through cracks, and the single staircase twisted like a serpent from bottom to top. She lived in the highest chamber, where a wooden door, bound with iron, sealed her fate. The floor was bare, save for a thin mat of woven straw, a chipped clay bowl for food, and a pitcher of water that was filled every few days by guards who never spoke. They avoided her eyes, as though one glance might let her spirit seep into theirs. Their silence was a heavier chain than the iron itself, for it reminded her daily that she was less than human in their eyes, an outcast, a warning, a secret best hidden away. Yet even in her isolation she felt the world pressing close. The forest was alive with unseen presences. Sometimes at dusk, when the wind curled through the cracks, she heard voices, low, layered, ancient. They did not speak in words she knew, but their tone was neither cruel nor kind. It was as if the forest itself was aware of her, watching her with a patience no human could hold. On stormy nights, when the tower trembled under the weight of thunder, she felt her blood stir. Something within her called out, like a tide pulled by the moon, reminding her she was not weak. She was not meant to be silent. She remembered the day they carried her up the winding steps. The elders had walked in front, their staffs clattering against stone, muttering prayers to ward off her spirit. Behind her, villagers whispered, their eyes darting away when she looked at them. Her mother had wept silently, her hands clutched to her chest, while her father stood still as a carved figure, unable, or unwilling, to fight for her. When the door shut and the key turned, she had thought it was the end of her life. But as days stretched into months, she began to see it differently. The tower was not only a prison. It was a place where she was forced to face herself, to listen to the silence and discover the rhythms beneath it. The wind seemed to know her name. They slipped through cracks, brushing her hair, cooling her skin when the heat of fear burned her. They carried scents, pine, rain-soaked earth, sometimes even smoke from distant fires. Once, in the depth of winter, the wind brought the faint sound of drums from a festival in the village below, a cruel reminder of the life denied to her. But instead of breaking her, it hardened her resolve. She began to realize that the people had locked her away not because she was cursed, but because she carried something they could not understand. Power frightens those who do not possess it. And power, whether bound or free, cannot remain hidden forever. Every night before she slept, she pressed her hand against the cold stone wall and whispered into the darkness. "I am here," she would say softly, not knowing who, or what, listened. And always, the wind answered, rattling against the tower as if promising it had heard. Though her captors believed they had buried her spirit in silence, they had unknowingly placed her in the heart of its awakening. The tower stood like a dark wound against the sky, its stone walls old yet unbroken, reaching upward as though they were built not for shelter but for eternal confinement. The villagers called it cursed, a place where shadows whispered at night and where storms always seemed to linger, drawn to its crown of jagged spires. Inside it she lived, though no one guarded her and no chains bound her wrists or ankles. Her prison was not forged of iron, but of belief, belief so deeply carved into the hearts of the villagers that even she sometimes doubted her own freedom. They had locked her away not with bars but with fear, and fear was heavier than iron. Every morning she rose to see the sun breaking through the trees far below, and every evening she listened to the restless wind rattling through the cracks in the stone, as if even the elements pitied her isolation. The silence inside the tower was never complete. It carried the weight of whispers, the memory of footsteps that had once walked the same floor before her. Some said the tower had consumed others before her, that no one who entered could leave. When she pressed her palms against the walls, they felt alive, cold, unmoving, yet humming faintly, as though they too remembered the despair of all who had been caged within. The villagers, whenever they looked toward the tower, would shudder and cross themselves, as if its presence could spill into their lives. They told stories that she was cursed, dangerous, marked by a spirit that would unravel their lives if she were allowed to walk free. These stories, repeated for years, had built her cage as surely as any iron lock. She could see them sometimes in the distance, the tiny dots of their fires at night, hear their faint voices carried by the wind, but none dared to approach. She was close enough to watch life unfold, yet barred from it all by stone and superstition. It was not hunger or thirst that tormented her, for food was sometimes left at the base of the tower, carried by those too afraid to look her in the eyes. It was not even loneliness, though that gnawed at her spirit. It was the knowledge that the world had decided for her, that her fate was to live and die within these walls, never to set foot on the earth below. Her body was free of chains, but her spirit was trapped in an invisible web, spun from fear, suspicion, and lies. At times she walked the narrow space of her prison, pacing in circles until the walls blurred. At times she pressed her ear to the cracks, listening to the outside world as if it might speak to her. And at times she closed her eyes and imagined herself walking out, placing her bare feet on the damp grass, breathing in the scent of rain-soaked soil, touching the bark of a tree without stones standing between them. But always the vision would fade, replaced again by the pressing certainty of the cursed tower, the belief that no one had ever escaped, that no one ever could. And yet, deep within her chest, something resisted. Something whispered that this prison without chains was only as strong as the fear that fed it. Something told her the walls might one day crack, not by the villagers' hands but by her own. The nights in the tower were long, filled with silence so heavy it pressed against her chest. She would curl up by the narrow window, the only slit that connected her to the outside world, watching the trees sway and the moon cast shadows across the forest floor far below. At first she thought it was her imagination when she heard it, a faint hum like a melody slipping through the cracks of stone. She pressed her ear to the cold wall, but the sound did not come from within. It drifted in with the night air, carried by the restless wind. It wasn't just music, it was something in between a lullaby and a warning, soft enough to soothe but sharp enough to unsettle. She closed her eyes, listening intently, and soon realized it wasn't only a song, it was words. Fragmented, elusive, spoken in tones that seemed older than the village itself. The whispers told her of paths hidden by roots, of keys shaped not by hands but by storms, of truths buried in silence. Sometimes they comforted her, like a mother's voice promising she wasn't alone. Other times they chilled her, hissing warnings of dangers that waited both inside and outside the tower. She wondered if the spirits of the forest had chosen her, or if the tower itself had begun to speak. Night after night the voices returned. They spoke of freedom yet also of betrayal. They told her she must wait for the wind's gift, a moment when the storms would turn from enemy to ally. Though her captors believed the tower was a prison too strong to be broken, she was beginning to believe otherwise. The whispers were teaching her patience, filling her with a strange hope that mingled with fear. The lullabies wrapped her in a fragile comfort, but the warnings made her heart race. The wind was no longer just a force that howled through the night, it had become her companion, her messenger, her keeper of secrets. And deep down she began to understand, the wind had chosen her, and it would not abandon her until its message was fulfilled. The girl's days stretched endlessly in the tower, each one folding into the next until time itself felt like a punishment. She wandered the circular stone chamber, pressing her palms to the rough walls as if they might reveal some secret. One morning, as the mist clung to the windows and the forest outside whispered in shades of green and gray, her eyes fell upon something she had not truly noticed before. At the base of the heavy wooden door, half hidden by layers of dust and neglect, was a small rusted keyhole. Its iron rim was corroded, its edges jagged, but it was undeniably there, a reminder that this door had once been meant to open. She crouched down, running her finger along the cold metal, and a sharp chill coursed through her body, as though the tower itself disapproved of her discovery. The villagers had spoken often about the door when they first locked her inside, but their words had always been meant as final. They claimed the key was lost forever, tossed into the deepest parts of the river that ran through the valley, carried away so no hand could ever retrieve it. For years they had told the story of how the cursed child was sealed within stone, the door closed by iron and wood, and the key destroyed to ensure she remained forgotten. Yet here it was, a keyhole that still hungered for a shape that no longer existed. The realization filled her with equal measures of sorrow and hope. Perhaps the villagers were right and there was no key. Or perhaps they had underestimated the will of the wind, the whispers, and the strange fate that clung to her spirit. As she traced the outline of the lock, her heart quickened. She had never before thought of escape as possible. The tower had been her entire world, its walls both prison and shelter. But the existence of that keyhole ignited something inside her, a flame of defiance that had long been buried beneath despair. She pressed her ear against the wood of the door, listening. For the first time she imagined what might be on the other side, not just the storms and forests, but life, villages, rivers, laughter, and freedom. Her mind painted scenes she had never lived, and yet the possibility of them felt real enough to ache. But the keyhole also reminded her of cruelty. It was proof that those who feared her had not trusted chains alone. They had locked her in a place that could be opened, then destroyed the very thing that could save her. They had wanted her to live with the knowledge that freedom was possible, yet forever out of reach. The rust, the dust, and the silence of the lock seemed to mock her. And still she could not look away. Every day she found herself drawn back to it, crouching before the door, whispering questions to the unyielding metal. Who forged you? Who held the key last? Did they weep as they cast it into the waters, or did they laugh? One night, when the moonlight poured silver across the floor and the wind sang louder than ever before, she knelt before the door again. The wind's voice seemed to curl through the cracks in the stone, carrying a message she could not fully understand. It was as if the air itself was guiding her gaze toward the lock, urging her to see it not as a dead relic, but as a waiting mouth hungry for something yet to come. She placed her palm against the door, just beside the rusted hole, and whispered back into the darkness, "If there is no key, then let the wind make one for me." From that moment onward, the keyhole was no longer simply a mark of imprisonment. It became her companion, her secret hope, her test of faith. Each morning she would wake and look at it, searching for change, and each night she would listen to the songs of the wind, waiting for a sign. And though no key yet appeared, she began to believe in the possibility that one day, somehow, the silence of the lock would break. It was as though the tower itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when destiny would return with the shape of freedom in its hand. In the quiet of the night, when exhaustion finally pulled her into restless sleep, the tower transformed. No longer was it made of stone and shadow, it became a hall of light where the air shimmered with voices from long before her time. Her ancestors appeared not as pale spirits, but as figures wrapped in fire, water, and earth, their eyes shining like the stars she longed to see. They gathered around her, whispering her name as if it was not only hers, but the name of something greater. She felt their presence settle deep into her bones, as though her blood was their river and her breath was their wind. One night her grandmother's voice, strong and calm, rose above the others. "Child of the tower," she said, "you were never meant to remain here. The walls cannot hold what was born to walk with storms." Her heart stirred, uncertain whether it was dream or truth, but the warmth of that voice sank into her, a comfort she had never known. Another night, a warrior ancestor, scarred by battle yet glowing with strength, bent down and whispered, "The chains you feel are only shadows. The path waits beyond stone and it waits for you." Each dream brought new fragments of wisdom, like threads weaving themselves into a tapestry she could not yet see in full. The girl began to look forward to the night, for though she was trapped by day, her dreams carried her into freedom. She felt as though the ancestors were placing a secret inside her, something the villagers who feared her spirit could never take away. When storms rattled the tower windows, she realized they no longer frightened her. The thunder sounded like her ancestors' drums, and the lightning was their torchlight, guiding her. She started to understand. Her destiny was not to wither in silence, but to awaken what was buried inside her. One dream was sharper than the rest. She stood in a field where the grass bent like waves, and the wind pressed against her face as if it was alive. A tall woman cloaked in shadows and stars approached her. "Daughter," she said, her voice like both lullaby and command, "your spirit was never meant to be caged. The tower is not your end but your beginning. When the wind calls, follow it. It carries more than whispers, it carries keys." The girl awoke with a gasp, her hands trembling, her heart pounding with the certainty that she was not alone in her suffering. Something beyond the tower was waiting for her, something the ancestors demanded she find. Each dream left her stronger than before, and though the villagers might believe the tower erased her from the world, she knew now she was only being shaped. The voices of her ancestors would not allow her to fade into silence. They were reminders that her story stretched far beyond the stone walls, that her bloodline carried storms, freedom, and destiny. She began to press her ear to the cracks in the tower, waiting for the day the wind would rise and bring her more than whispers. For in her heart, she now believed, her escape would not be carved by her hands alone, but by the power of all who lived before her, guiding her spirit into a future the villagers could never cage. The storm came suddenly, rolling in with a roar that shook the ancient tower to its foundations. The girl huddled in the shadows of her small chamber, her thin blanket clutched around her shoulders. She had grown used to storms. After all, the tower seemed to invite them, perched on its lonely hill surrounded by endless forest. But this one felt different. The thunder did not rumble, it cracked like the snapping of bones. The lightning illuminated her walls again and again, revealing cracks she had not seen before, cracks that seemed to widen with every strike. And the wind, it was no ordinary wind. It screamed as though alive, pressing against the stones, slipping through the cracks, whistling under the door like a voice desperate to be heard. She sat upright, her pulse quickening. For nights she had heard whispers in the wind, lullabies and warnings, voices that seemed both strange and familiar. But now those whispers rose to a howl, urgent and unrelenting, like a chorus demanding she listen. She crept closer to the door, pressing her ear against the cold wood, the storm's voice vibrating through her bones. Her heart thudded as if answering a call. And then, in the midst of the storm's frenzy, something soft brushed her foot. She flinched and stumbled back. For a moment she thought it was a trick of her mind, loneliness and despair weaving illusions. But when she dared to look down, her eyes widened. There, just beneath the heavy wooden door, the wind had delivered a gift, a small silver key glowing faintly in the flickering stormlight. She gasped and knelt to touch it. It was cold at first, icy as though it had been resting in the heart of the storm itself, but the moment her fingers curled around it, warmth spread through her hand, climbing her arm, until it settled deep inside her chest. The glow pulsed like a heartbeat as though the key itself was alive. She turned it over and over in her palm, marveling at the delicate engravings etched into the metal, spirals, feathers, and the shapes of waves. Symbols she had seen before only in her dreams, when her ancestors had spoken to her of destiny. Tears filled her eyes. She thought of the keyhole she had discovered days before, rusted and forgotten, mocked by the villagers who had tossed the real key away long ago. Yet now, by some miracle, or perhaps by fate, the wind had brought her another. Could this be what her ancestors had meant? Was this her chance to leave behind the prison that had been her world for so long? She held the key tightly, pressing it to her lips as though in prayer. The storm outside raged, but instead of fear, she felt a growing strength, a fire within her that no wall or curse could suppress. She rose to her feet and walked to the door, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. The tower groaned around her as though warning her not to try. But she was no longer afraid. For the first time she believed. She slid the glowing key into the rusted lock, her breath caught between hope and dread. The storm seemed to pause, holding its breath with her. The key turned with a sound both ancient and new, a grinding click followed by the sigh of metal surrendering after years of silence. The glow flared, lighting the doorframe like a halo. The girl pressed her hand against the door. It no longer felt like an immovable wall but like a threshold waiting to be crossed. She whispered a thank you to the wind, to her ancestors, to the storm itself. And then she pushed. The door shuddered, creaked, and began to open. And beyond it, something awaited, something greater than the prison she had known, something her spirit had been born to meet. The wind had not abandoned her. It had chosen her. The moment her trembling fingers closed around the silver key, the tower itself seemed to awaken. A deep rumble spread through the ancient stones, and dust fell from the ceiling like forgotten ashes. For years the tower had stood silent, unyielding, watchful, more grave than home. Now it groaned and trembled as though some ancient oath was being broken. The girl's heart raced. She clutched the key tightly, feeling a strange warmth radiating from it, as though it pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The glow intensified, casting silver light across the damp stone walls, and in that light she saw something she had never seen before. Faint markings carved into the walls long ago, hidden beneath centuries of moss and neglect. They formed circles, spirals, and symbols that seemed to shift when she looked at them too long, as if the walls themselves breathed with life. The whispers in the wind, which had haunted her nights, returned now, stronger, clearer. But this time they were not distant murmurs, they were voices. Voices of her ancestors, rising and falling in solemn unity. Daughter of silence, child of storms, you were never a prisoner. You were the keeper of a secret long buried. Her chest tightened. A prisoner? She had believed it. She had accepted it. But now their words unraveled that lie. The villagers had locked her here, fearing her spirit, fearing her connection to the wind and storms that circled the tower. Yet the ancestors spoke of purpose, not punishment. She pressed her ear against the cold wood of the door, and for the first time she did not hear the emptiness of solitude. She heard chains breaking, not of iron but of silence itself. The silver key vibrated in her hand, pulling her toward the door. She raised it slowly, her body shivering with both dread and hope. The rusted keyhole she had stared at countless times seemed alive now, glowing faintly as though it had been waiting for this moment. But as she lifted the key closer, the tower rebelled. The ground shook harder, wind whistled through unseen cracks, and her ears filled with a deafening roar. It was as if the curse itself fought back, unwilling to release her. The girl staggered but did not let go of the key. She thought of her ancestors' visits in dreams, of their words of destiny, and with a cry she pressed the key forward. It slid into the keyhole with an ease that defied its rusted, ancient frame. A silence fell. A silence so heavy it pressed on her chest like a stone. And then, click. The sound was small, delicate, but it split through the silence like lightning through the sky. Chains she could not see but had always felt began to fracture. Around her, invisible bonds snapped, ropes of fear, shackles of forgotten curses. Her throat tightened and she gasped. For years she had spoken no word, her voice locked away by the same power that caged her in stone. But now a sound rose within her. Not a whisper, not a whimper, her voice. She cried out, raw and powerful, the sound echoing against the tower walls, reverberating through the storm outside. Her voice cracked the silence that had imprisoned her for so long. The curse was breaking, unraveling thread by thread, as if her voice was the missing piece to a forgotten song. The markings on the walls flared with light, each symbol igniting like fire. Spirals spun, circles pulsed, and ancient runes danced. The tower groaned louder, its stones splitting as though the structure itself resisted release. Yet her voice rose higher, growing steadier, bolder. She sang, not with melody she knew, but with one given to her by the wind and her ancestors. It was a song of defiance and birth, of storms and freedom, of chains snapping like brittle twigs. Outside the storm answered. Thunder cracked, lightning split the sky, and the forest swayed in wild reverence. The villagers, who had long believed her imprisoned forever, lifted their heads as the winds carried her voice across the land. For the first time, they heard not the silence of fear but the cry of truth. The tower's heavy door shuddered. Splinters flew as cracks spread across it. The silver key glowed brighter, and with one final push the girl twisted it. The door burst open. Wind rushed inside, filling the tower with light and movement. It swirled around her like an embrace, lifting her hair, drying her tears. She stepped forward, her bare feet touching the threshold she had never crossed. For a heartbeat, fear clutched her. What if the villagers were waiting to cast her back? What if the curse still lingered, stronger beyond these walls? But then she remembered, the tower was not her prison. Silence was. And silence had been broken. She stepped into the storm. The ground beneath her trembled one last time before the tower gave a final groan and collapsed behind her, falling into ruin. Dust and stones scattered, swallowed by wind and rain. No longer would it stand as a monument to fear. It was gone and she remained. The villagers, gathered at the forest's edge, stared in awe and dread. Their whispered fears carried through the storm. She has returned, she has broken it, she is not cursed, she is chosen. The girl, once voiceless, lifted her head. Her eyes glowed faintly with the reflection of the storm, her breath steady, her spirit unbroken. The ancestors' whispers quieted into a hum, like a heartbeat in the wind. She understood now. She had not been locked away to be forgotten. She had been locked away because her voice carried power, the power to break chains not only for herself but for all who were bound by silence. Lightning split the sky once more, and she raised her hands to the storm. Her voice rose again, not in sorrow, not in fear, but in strength. The silver key trembled in her hand as though it carried a life of its own. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. The villagers had whispered for years that no one could leave the cursed tower, that the moment its door opened, the shadows guarding it would awaken. Now, as the lock clicked open, she realized those stories were not tales meant to frighten children. They were warnings. The heavy door groaned as it swung wide, releasing a gust of air that smelled of damp earth and old secrets. Beyond the threshold, the night was alive. The moon cast a pale light over the clearing, but the darkness pressed thick around it, heavy and restless. She took one step forward, her bare feet meeting the cold stone of the threshold, and the air rippled like water disturbed by a stone. Then they appeared. Shadows, not fully human yet not entirely formless, rose from the ground as though pulled from the soil itself. Their shapes flickered between men, women, and beasts, as if each one carried fragments of countless lives within. Their eyes glowed faintly, two small orbs of white fire, and their voices murmured in 1,000 whispers that made her ears ring. She had dreamt of these beings, though she had never seen them, guardians of the curse, spirits that lingered between the living and the dead. "You are not meant to leave," one of them said, its voice like wind whistling through broken reeds. "You carry the curse inside you," another added, circling closer. Her hands trembled, but she gripped the key tighter. "I was born in this tower, but I was not born for it," she whispered, repeating the words her ancestors had told her in her dreams. The spirits hissed at the name of the ancestors. Their shapes wavered, stretching into long clawed limbs that reached for her. One lunged, its form like smoke yet sharp as knives, and slashed across her arm. Pain burned hot, though no wound appeared, only a black mark spreading across her skin like ink. She staggered back, nearly retreating into the tower, but the door slammed shut behind her, locking her out. There was no turning back. Either she passed this trial or the curse would consume her forever. Drawing a deep breath, she pressed her palm over the black mark. The key in her hand grew warm, its silver glow pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The shadows recoiled slightly, hissing as if the light stung them. That gave her courage. "You guard these walls, but they were not built to hold me," she said, her voice shaking yet rising with each word. "My ancestors call me beyond this place. And I will not be silent any longer." The shadows swirled, forming a wall of darkness around her. Faces appeared in the black mass, twisted, sorrowful, enraged. They screamed without sound, a silence so loud it pierced her mind. She fell to her knees, clutching her head, but the wind rose suddenly, carrying with it the faint melody she had heard in her dreams, the lullaby mixed with warning, the voices of her ancestors. The song gave her strength. She pushed herself up, lifting the glowing key high above her head. Its light grew, not blinding but steady, like a flame that refused to be extinguished. The shadows shrieked and drew back, their forms unraveling as the glow spread outward. But the trial was not yet over. From the heart of the darkness, a single towering figure emerged, larger and more solid than the rest. Its body was draped in a cloak of shadows, its face hidden behind a mask carved from bone. In its hand, it held a staff made of twisted roots, pulsing with a dull red light. "You may silence the lesser ones," it boomed, its voice shaking the ground beneath her feet, "but I am the heart of the curse. If you wish to leave, you must pass through me." Her throat went dry. This was the spirit the villagers had feared most, the one they never spoke of by name. She knew if she faltered now, the tower would claim her soul. The figure raised its staff, striking the ground. The earth split, and a circle of fire erupted around her, trapping her in its center. The heat licked at her skin, the smoke stung her eyes. The shadows outside the circle wailed, their voices merging into a terrible chorus. But she remembered the dream, the voice of her grandmother whispering, "The fire is not your enemy. The fire is your test." Gritting her teeth, she stepped forward, through the flames. They seared her skin, but instead of burning her flesh, they peeled away the black mark on her arm, stripping it into ashes. The pain was sharp, but when she emerged on the other side, the glow of the key in her hand blazed brighter than ever. The bone-masked spirit roared, lifting its staff again, but she no longer trembled. With a cry that echoed from her chest and out into the night, she thrust the silver key forward. A beam of light burst forth, striking the staff. The red glow shattered, sparks scattering like dying stars. The spirit stumbled back, its cloak of shadows ripping apart. Behind the mask was no face, only emptiness, and as the light poured into it, the void collapsed inward, vanishing into nothing. The other shadows dissolved with it, their cries fading into the wind until silence fell. The fire around her died down, leaving only the pale glow of the moon. The night was still once more. Breathing hard, she lowered the key, now cool in her hand. The path beyond the tower stretched before her, dark yet free of chains. She had escaped, but she knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere beyond the trees, the world was waiting, and so were the truths that had been hidden from her all her life. For the first time she stepped fully outside the cursed tower. And the wind carried her name. The first rays of dawn fell upon her face as she stepped out of the forest path that led into the village. The earth was damp with dew, the air thick with the scent of soil and smoke. Every step she took was steady, deliberate, her bare feet pressing into the ground like roots reclaiming their soil. She was no longer the girl the villagers had cast away, trembling and voiceless. The tower had shaped her into something else, something deeper, something the people had once feared in whispers and forgotten in stories. Now she returned not as a prisoner but as a force reborn. Her hair, once tangled and frail, now fell like a dark curtain around her face, moving with the breeze that seemed to follow her wherever she walked. Her eyes, sharp and luminous, carried the mystery of nights filled with whispers, of ancestors' voices carved into her soul. In them flickered both tenderness and danger, the promise of protection for the innocent and judgment for the guilty. Villagers who spotted her from afar stopped in their tracks. Buckets of water were dropped, baskets of grain were abandoned mid-carry. A mother pulled her child close as if to shield them, though her child gazed curiously, sensing something beautiful rather than terrifying. Whispers rippled through the air. Is it her? No, she was lost, she could not have survived. But look at her eyes, those are not the eyes of the girl we left behind. She walked straight down the central path of the village, and the wind stirred around her, carrying with it the faint sound of voices, the same lullabies and warnings she had once heard in the tower at night. Now they swirled outside, audible to others. The elders stiffened, recognizing the songs of the ancestors that had not been heard in generations. The wind curled around rooftops, rattling wooden beams, tugging at clothing, making the people tremble. Her silence was heavier than words. Every gaze followed her, every heartbeat quickened as she approached the village square. There, beneath the ancient tree where judgments were once pronounced, she stopped. Her presence demanded acknowledgement, yet she spoke nothing. Instead, she lifted her hand slowly, and the silver key she had carried, the gift of the wind, gleamed in her palm. Its glow was faint in daylight but unmistakably alive. The villagers gasped. An old woman fell to her knees, tears running down her cheeks. The prophecy, it was true, she whispered. The girl who would return with the key of silence. She is chosen. Others looked away in shame. Men who had mocked her, women who had turned their backs when she cried for mercy, now lowered their eyes, their mouths dry. They remembered their cruelty, the ease with which they had discarded her life, the relief they had felt when the tower swallowed her whole. None had thought they would face her again, alive, much less transformed into something that carried the aura of power and judgment. At last, her voice broke the silence. It was not weak nor cracked as it had once been, but smooth, steady, and commanding, laced with echoes of the spirits that had spoken to her. You built your peace upon my suffering. You buried me in silence, but silence has a voice. It is the wind, the ancestors, and now, it is me. Her words carried across the square, reverberating through the air, making even the earth seem to hum. Some villagers covered their ears not because the sound hurt them, but because it revealed their guilt. Others, however, felt hope stir within their chests, recognizing that her return was not only a reckoning but also a gift. Children, braver than their parents, stepped closer. One little girl, holding a carved wooden doll, looked up at her with wide eyes. Did the wind really speak to you? The child asked softly. She knelt, lowering herself so her gaze met the child's. The edges of her lips curled into the faintest smile. Yes, she said gently. And it will speak to you too if you listen. The crowd seemed to exhale as one. Fear loosened its grip, though it did not disappear. For power was still power, and she radiated it with every breath. She stood again, lifting her chin toward the elders. I have not come for vengeance, she declared, though her voice cut like a blade. But I have not come to forget either. The tower tried to keep me caged, but it only awakened what you tried to bury. I am not the girl you silenced, I am the voice that silence created. The wind surged through the square, leaves and dust spiraling upward, tugging at clothes and hair. It did not harm anyone, but it carried the weight of her words, pressing them into the hearts of all who listened. From that day forward, the village knew she was not simply one of them. She was something more, a bridge between the living and the ancestors, a woman bound not by chains but by purpose. Some feared her, some revered her, but none could deny her. The tower had sought to erase her, yet it had only carved her into legend. And as the villagers gathered, caught between awe and guilt, between fear and hope, she turned her gaze to the horizon. For though she had returned to them, her journey was far from over. The wind still whispered, the ancestors still called, and her destiny stretched far beyond the village walls. The wind did not leave her when she returned to the village. It moved at her heels as though it had chosen her forever, a constant reminder that she was no longer the girl who had once been silenced and locked away. Every step she took stirred a whisper in the air, every word she spoke carried with it the faint breath of the storm. The villagers watched her in awe, some in fear, some in shame, for they knew they had cast her aside, but the spirits of the air had raised her higher than any of them could have imagined. Children ran after her, their laughter carried by the breeze that danced in circles around her feet. Women bowed their heads, whispering prayers as if she were a walking omen. Men who had once mocked her now dared not meet her gaze, for her eyes glimmered like storm clouds and her voice carried the strength of thunder. She was not only one of them anymore, she was something beyond, a bridge between the world of the living and the whispers of the unseen. At night, the wind would curl around her hut like a guardian, singing songs only she could fully understand. It carried the voices of her ancestors, reassuring her, guiding her, warning her of storms yet to come. She realized that the tower had not only been her prison, it had been her place of awakening. The silence she once endured had carved out a space in her soul where the voices of spirits could now live. The villagers began to approach her, one by one. Some came in guilt, offering baskets of food or jars of milk, begging for forgiveness. Others came in fear, asking her to bless their crops or heal their sick children, for they believed her new gift could bend the forces of nature. She listened, sometimes with pity, sometimes with stern silence. She had not forgotten what they had done to her, but the wind reminded her of her destiny. It whispered, "You were chosen not for vengeance but for balance." One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, a storm gathered in the distance. Black clouds rolled across the horizon, and the villagers grew restless, remembering the tales of floods and lightning that had once destroyed entire clans. They turned to her, their eyes filled with desperation. "Will you call off the storm?" they pleaded. "Will you ask the wind to spare us?" She stood tall at the edge of the village, her hair whipping around her face as the first drops of rain kissed the earth. She raised her hand, and the wind rushed to her palm like a faithful companion. The people gasped, for they saw how the storm seemed to bend toward her, circling but never striking. She closed her eyes and whispered words the ancestors had taught her in dreams. The clouds rumbled, the lightning flashed, but the storm passed around the village, leaving the huts untouched, the fields safe. From that night forward, she was no longer seen as the girl they had betrayed. She was called Daughter of the Wind. Songs were sung about her at firesides, stories told of the woman who had broken free of her chains and walked with the storm at her side. Her legend spread to neighboring clans, and travelers came to see her, hoping to witness the miracle of the wind that obeyed her call. Yet she remained humble, remembering the nights of loneliness, the silence of the tower, the rusted keyhole that no one believed would ever open. Those memories anchored her, keeping her from becoming prideful. She knew that the gift was not hers alone. It belonged to the spirits who had chosen her, to the ancestors who had dreamed her destiny long before she was born. And so she lived not as a prisoner, not as an outcast, but as a guardian. Wherever she walked, the wind followed her, sometimes gentle as a mother's touch, sometimes fierce as a warrior's cry. The villagers came to learn that no prison, no curse, no chain could ever hold one who was chosen by the spirits. Her story became a warning and a promise, that those cast aside may rise with powers greater than the world can imagine, and that the breath of the wind will always find its way through even the smallest crack in the strongest wall.